We've obviously been following the situation in Melbourne very closely and have made the decision, based on the most recent decision from Melbourne to do a lockdown in Melbourne, we've made the decision to extend our pause for a further 7 days, so that it extends the current pause restricting travel from Victoria to New Zealand by a further 7 days, taking us through to next Friday. In addition to that, we're putting in place some further requirements using the Health Act, which the Director-General will run through the detail of shortly. One of the most obvious ones, which is already in place, is that anybody who's been in one of the locations of interest cannot travel to New Zealand, even if they are no longer in Victoria. They cannot travel to New Zealand for at least 14 days after they have been in that potential place where they could have been exposed to COVID-19, and we're making some further adjustments to those requirements as well, which the Director-General will run through in a moment. We are considering whether further restrictions should be put in place. That includes things like pre-departure testing, and whether pre-departure testing should apply, and if so, to whom, and we'll make further decisions on that in the next 24 hours or so. At the moment, the main message is that the travel has been, will continue to be paused. There will continue to be some restrictions for those who are no longer in Victoria but who are in locations of interest. And in addition to that, we have some further instructions for those who are currently in New Zealand, which I'll get the Director-General to run through now, and then we can open up for your questions.
Thank you, Minister. Kia ora, everyone. So I've got some quite formal language I'm going to use, which is around the legal obligations that the Section 70 notice puts in place, and then I'll explain what it means. So a direction under Section 70 of the Health Act 1956 issued today applies to any person who was in the Greater Melbourne area between the 20th and 25th of May. It requires them to do the following: isolate or quarantine at their usual place of residence or accommodation, contact Healthline and advise that they are a close or casual contact of a COVID-19 case in Melbourne, to submit for testing at a time and place appropriate to their location, and except for reporting and submitting to testing, remain isolated or quarantined at their usual place of residence, as advised by a medical officer of health, for no longer than 14 days, and failure or refusal to comply is an offence under Section 72 of the Health Act 1956. So what that basically means is anyone who has travelled to New Zealand who has been in the Greater Melbourne area since the 20th of, which is last Thursday, the 20th of May, is now required to isolate, be tested, and remain isolated until they receive the test result. That is in addition to those who have travelled back since the 11th of May, who have or travelled to New Zealand and who have been in a place of interest or in the Whittlesea city area. As previously was required, those people since the 11th of May who have travelled back are required to isolate, be tested, and remain isolated until they receive a negative test result. So essentially, the reason we've gone back to last Thursday, the 20th, is because that's when the latest cases that have come out of Melbourne, the individual that sparked off that group in a workplace was infectious in the workplace, and there are a number of locations of interest that have appeared now that are in the central city where people travelling to New Zealand may well have been. So we're applying a precautionary approach and asking everyone who has been in Greater Melbourne, who has travelled to New Zealand since the 20th of May inclusive, to isolate, be tested, and remain isolated until they get that negative test result back. Thank you, Mr.
Will those New Zealanders who are applying to get their product and chased, do they have to?
We will certainly be endeavouring to get in touch with them. We have contact information from them. That's been part of our Trans-Tasman arrangements, making sure we've got contact information. In some cases it's an email address, in some cases it's a mobile number, or in some cases it's both. So it really depends on what contact information we have for them. But yes, we will be endeavouring to keep in contact with people. There's a lot of them, so they shouldn't all be expecting to be contacted immediately, although the fastest way to get in touch with them is to send out emails. Those people who are covered, many of those people covered, will already have been receiving updates from health. Well, I think
we're expecting about 5,000.
We're expecting around 5,000.
Well, we still think the risk is low. However, what we have seen is a big increase in the number of locations of interest, now up over 80, and in particular those recent ones over the weekend when there was quite a group of people who have now been identified as COVID positive, who were in a number of locations of interest which were higher risk, so crowded, close contact and confined, bars and clubs and so on. So there's a higher risk there, and we think it's prudent to just ask everyone who's been in Melbourne to isolate and be tested.
Minister, what does this decision mean for the upcoming election between Scott Morrison and Jacinda Ardern that is scheduled to take place in New Zealand?
At this point, we're still expecting that to take place. People who are travelling to New Zealand for that will be travelling on a dedicated flight from Canberra. That flight should still be able to go ahead. Obviously, the same restrictions would apply there. So if people have been in one of those locations of interest, then they should not be getting on that flight. If we do introduce anything further around pre-departure testing, for example, depending on whether somebody falls within the scope of that, then that may apply to those people. We haven't made that decision yet. We're still considering that. We'll take some further advice on that before we did that.
With 5,000 people said to be affected by this, can you give the public a date on you in contact with them?
Look, in terms of the people who are in New Zealand, we'll obviously be getting in touch with them as soon as possible. What the Director-General has just done now, though, is provide a legal notification through all of you, through the media, that requirement is now in place. We'll obviously do everything we can to contact them to make sure that they know that that requirement is in place and that it affects them.
What's the plan period? I mean, do you wait a couple of days to give people a chance to go and get tested, and then obviously that pops up in your system and you can say, right, well, they have been, or do you just start even now and say, right, this is what you do?
They'll certainly get notification now, but in terms of the follow-up, I'll ask the Director-General to comment on that.
Yes, thanks, Minister. So they'll get an email pretty promptly. In fact, as the Minister said, that all these people and more have already received an email. There was over 10,000 sent out at the start of the pause. We will follow up with an additional email. There'll obviously be notification through the media, and then we will follow up with phone calls. That's the intention, is to use our contact tracing centre to follow up with phone calls for those we have phone numbers for. We'll probably start that tonight and continue it through tomorrow. Look, our experience in this case is that most people get the message and they immediately isolate and they get the test, and then they'll wait for that test result. The follow-up with email and phone is just to make sure they've had that message, so I'm expecting a high degree of cooperation.
Could we expect further testing stations across the country to accommodate these 5,000 people that need to be tested?
Look, we do have good capability. The people concerned will be spread across the country. We do have good testing capability. At its peak, we've been testing up to, I think, where we've got to our real peak, testing up to about 26,000 people a day was our high point. I don't think we'll get anywhere near to that as a result of this. So, yes, I'm satisfied that there's good, testing availability out there for those who will need to comply.
What's your general advice to New Zealanders in Melbourne at the moment?
Hunker down, follow the rules. They're going into a lockdown period. Make sure that you are following all of the rules set by the government over there. If this were to go on for longer than 7 days, then we'd obviously provide further advice at that point.
On Tuesday,
Look, our pause continues until next Friday. We'll obviously keep things under review. If the lockdown were to end, if we were to be satisfied that the risk at that point had returned to a level where we thought we would, resume normal flights, then people would be able to come home. If the pause for yes, that's right. If the pause for any reason were to continue, though, then we would look at other options, including whether or not we provided emergency travel back for those who absolutely desperately needed to come back urgently.
You don't expect that in the next 7 days?
That won't happen in the next 7 days.
on Tuesday, you noted that the pause was a close call. Is there a sense of relief now that things have spiralled out of control that we moved?
Look, with all of these things, you always look back on things in hindsight and you decide whether or not you moved fast enough, too fast, too slow, and so on. The reality here is I think we got this one about right. I think that it was a line call, but ultimately it was the right one.
And is there any indication at this point that it could impact the wider Trans-Tasman bubble?
Look, ultimately that's going to depend what happens over the next 7 days.
This isn't the current.
Joe.
Message was pretty hard to people, but have you heard any advice from EFAT, or are you starting to receive calls from people who didn't prepare for this and are in a situation where they don't have the means?
I haven't had any significant feedback about that so far, but obviously we'll keep that under review. Now, for a 3-day pause, we would expect most people would be able to, to cope with that. Extending that out to what will now effectively be 10 days, that may well put a lot more pressure on some people, so we may have some more feedback that comes through as a result of that. But we did indicate at the beginning that people could have to isolate in situ for a period of time, potentially a couple of weeks, was I think the language that I used at the time. And so we're still within that window now. If it was to continue going on, so if this continued to grow in Melbourne, then we would look to other options. We have set aside some rooms in managed isolation, specifically as a trans-Tasman contingency. We do have some other rooms available there at the moment, if we were needing to use them.
So for this 10-day period, there's no flexibility on that if you were to get calls from people who are saying that they don't have the ability to pay for hotels or whatever. Is there an intention process? Have you got anything that could come into play in this?
Look, ultimately they should shelter in place, which is what we have told them they need to be prepared to do.
In terms of those.
When it comes to the trans-Tasman bubble, that periodically things like this will happen.
I think the reality is, as long as we are living in a world where COVID-19 continues to dominate, and it's easy to forget that in New Zealand at the moment, but it does continue to dominate around the globe, we do have to expect that things are going to be disrupted from time to time. We've been very fortunate in New Zealand that we have not had a lot of disruption in this year, aside from our February issue. But the reality here is that with Trans-Tasman, that opens up a whole new set of challenges and issues. And we were pretty clear about that when we opened up the Trans-Tasman bubble, and we need to respond quickly to those, and people need to be prepared for the fact that their plans will be disrupted when that happens.
What restrictions are on people who visit Victoria but not any places of interest coming to New Zealand?
So if they have been in Victoria since we started the pause, then they will need to. Then they cannot come to New Zealand. If they have not been if they've been there, say, in a week or two prior, they've not been to any locations of interest. At this point, they can still come. But as I've said, we're considering that over the next, overnight, whether there should be any additional requirements, pre-departure testing, and so on. And if we were to put that in place, who that would apply to.
This may not be a first disruption to the Trans-Tasman bubble, but based off of the early indications from what you're seeing out of Victoria in terms of the number of cases, the number of locations, and the variant at play, is this the most significant challenge to the bubble yet?
I think that's probably true. It's certainly the biggest challenge to the bubble in terms of the number of cases that we are dealing with here.
How will that be policed or enforced, the locations of interest? I mean, how do you check? How do you know if someone has actually been there or not?
Look, I think there is always going to be an element of honesty here. We do have to rely on people being honest about where they have been. The vast majority of Australians, as with New Zealanders, don't want to be responsible for spreading COVID-19. The feedback that we have had and what we have seen from our own restrictions we've had to put them in place is that people want to do the right thing. They want to know what's expected of them. We communicate that very clearly, and what you've just seen from the Director General is a very clear communication of exactly what's required of people.
If things go on for longer, you say there's options as a contingency in MIQ. What does that look like? Do sort of people come in and stay for free in MIQ? Or?
Look, we haven't made decisions on that at the moment. And at this point, the pause is for a further 7 days. If it looked like it was going to go on for longer, we would certainly provide further guidance well before that 10-day period would be up.
So it's possible people could be brought over and stay for free in MIQ?
I think if this continued to grow, if we had cause for further concern, then midway through the week next week, people could expect to have further guidance from us on what we would do next.
You kind of mentioned that it would be sort of emergency contingency, 7 days, right? So it would be that
Look, the reality is we're talking thousands of people here, and so we simply couldn't bring them all back all at once. So there would have to be some rationing involved.
It's just people holidaying there as well. How many people do you know travel to Melbourne in recent weeks?
I don't have the exact numbers, but overall Trans-Tasman travel-wise, we've seen slightly more people come to New Zealand from Australia than go travel the other way, but I don't have a state-by-state breakdown off the top of my head for that one. I'll probably get that for you, though. Look, I can tell you we've had very good coverage of our Group 1 and Group 2. Those are the most at-risk New Zealanders. Those are the people working at the border, the people working in our frontline health settings and so on. Very good coverage there. And we're on our way through Group 3. Things are a bit different in the vaccine rollout between New Zealand and Australia. They're still using 2 different vaccines, Pfizer and AstraZeneca. We're not using the AstraZeneca vaccine in New Zealand at the moment. So there are different supply challenges on either side of the Tasman. Look, I'm confident that with the vaccines that we have available, we are as best positioned as we could be. Look, people I think are well familiar with our alert level framework. Were we to experience something in New Zealand, we would respond to that as we have previously, using our alert level framework as the guidance.
And I guess on that for New Zealanders, is this something to be concerned about?
Look, COVID-19, I can't reiterate this enough, COVID-19 continues to be something to be concerned about, and it's going to continue to be something to be concerned about for some time. So all of the things that we ask New Zealanders to do around staying home when they're sick, getting tested if they start to show symptoms, hand hygiene, scanning their QR codes, all of those things are just as important now as they were last year. People still need to keep doing those things because when anything happens, speed becomes very, very important. And everybody can be prepared to make sure that we are in a position to move quickly if we need to. That's how we stop having to escalate alert levels. So we're going to have to keep being prepared for quite some time now, at least until the end of the year, possibly into next year. If everybody does that, then the potential for restrictions in New Zealand is lessened. I think that was in the statement. I just don't. 7:59. Sorry, yeah, I couldn't remember the exact time the first one came into force.
5,000 people, roughly 5,000 in New Zealand who are recently in Melbourne, and then we don't know how many New Zealanders there might be in Melbourne at most.
I'll just check whether the Director General has that.
Yes,
number.
That's correct. So we had from the 11th, when we sent the email out earlier in the week on Monday. When the pause came in place, it was about 10,000, so we're thinking about 5,000. We don't know how many New Zealanders have travelled to Melbourne and haven't travelled back, yes. But as the Minister said, actually there's been more travel from Australia to New Zealand than the other way. And so I'm sure that any New Zealanders who are there, if they start to run into challenges or problems, that we'll soon get an idea of that.
Will you seek to find New Zealanders are stranger than was this pause in place?
Look, we'll certainly see what numbers we can get you, whether or not we have an ability to track whether they have subsequently returned. We'll be able to give you a bit of an indication of how many people we think might be in Melbourne, but I'll see if we can get you a better number.
And if some people have contracted COVID-19, what happens for them?
Then they would ultimately need to recover from COVID-19 and be given a clean bill of health before they could come back.
Right, so would they have to pay the MOQ while over there?
I am not sure what the Australian charging regime is there, so I'll just... that'll ultimately be up to the Australians in terms of what charges apply there, but we could probably find that out for you as well.